You ever feel like that guy? Like every day, maybe, or at least part of the day? Hey, good morning, everybody. Wow, it's great to see you here today. You're looking good. It's a beautiful day that the Lord has created. And what about that worship? Oh, my stars. Wow, that was awesome. Thank you, Holy Spirit, for coming down and just touching my heart. And I sense all of our hearts were blessed by that. Today, we are launching our spring semester of e-groups, small groups. If you've not been a part of our fellowship for a while, you may not be aware that we are a church of small groups. We don't have small groups. We are a church of small groups, and we encourage all of you to connect with a small group. Small group is where most of the ministry of this church happens, in fact. We do projects, we have other things that go on, and you get connected with people here that can share with you life. And that's what our small groups are all about. So in your worship folder, you'll see this little flyer that has a listing of all of our small groups that are going to be happening this semester. We have a few new ones, and most of the ones that were last semester are carrying on as well. You'll see information about the group in the flyer, and times and places and dates and the leader and contact information. The email addresses are given there for the leaders of each small group. If you have questions or you want to know more about it, just to contact the leader with the information that's given here, and they'll be happy to welcome you. I lead an e-group on Sunday nights here in the auditorium, just a pastor's Bible study. That will be starting 2 Sundays from tonight on February the 12th. So if you're part of my small group, I'll do that 2 weeks from tonight, okay? But just want you to note this. We'll be publishing this next week as well, so for people who may not be here, it's not too late. Get connected to a small group. I'm sure it will make a blessing and a difference in your life. It's made a difference in my life. Well, have you ever made a mess messier? Thank you. I've got one real honest guy up here on the front row. Yeah, I have too. In fact, you remember the story I told last week about, when I was 5 and I was going to paint my little red wagon, and I went out and got some paint to show my mom and dad to get permission to use the paint to paint my wagon. And we were living in a parsonage at that time. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's kind of a rent house for preachers. It belongs to the church, but they let us live in it. And so I grew up living in parsonages as a kid. And the story goes that the church had just sprung for brand new carpet in our parsonage. And so I was going out behind the garage, and I found some paint cans, and I shook them, and one had some paint in it. It looked kind of maroonish color. And so I got a screwdriver, took the lid off, and sure enough, it was almost full of paint. And so I was so excited that I went back in the house to show my dad to get permission to use this paint to paint my wagon. Well, when I walked all the way through the house, because they seemed to be in the back bedroom, the look on my mom and dad's face when they saw me was something I will never forget. In fact, it still causes shudders to go down my spine even yet today. Because apparently in my excitement, and as a 5-year-old, I had spilled paint from the front door all the way back to where they were, and I didn't even know it. Well, I told that story about the mess that I made, and it was a big mess, and I shared that this was brand new carpet. But what I didn't, Betty reminded me, said, you didn't tell them probably the biggest part. And I said, oh yeah, I forgot. That was on a Saturday, okay? And the next day, Sunday, the church had planned a reception so everyone in the church could come look at the new carpet in our parsonage. Yeah, I forgot that part. I made it messier by telling you that part. But, it's easy for us to have a mess. Everybody is a mess from one point or a time or another. I mean, if you are not in a mess right now, well, God bless you, but you're only one bad, dumb decision from being in a mess, and that'll come later. We're all just kind of messes. In fact, we talked the first week that we are a mess, and that's what usually brings us together, because we can identify with one another, because none of us are without messes. But sometimes we want to clean up a mess. We want to fix a mess, and the options that are available to us to do that sometimes are really, really bad. They only make the mess messier. And so today, what I want to talk to you about is how to avoid the You're going to make messes, but you don't have to follow through with making it worse. In other words, there's bad options that come with every mess. And I don't want you to have to go through any worse than what you already have in a mess. And so we're going to talk about that. This is our last series, closing up this series on addressing the mess. And I think this may be one of the most important ones of the others that we shared together. And today, to do that, I'm going to illustrate it by a favorite story. If you've been in church, grew up in church, you'll know at least parts of this story because it's a famous story about David. Now, let me just tell you the story of David really quick. David was a little boy, and one day his dad was visited by the prophet Samuel, and Samuel had come to their house to appoint the next king of Israel. And you know the story how Samuel went through all the sons of the family there, and none of them seemed to be the one. And he said, "Do you have any more sons?" And he said, "Yeah, well, I've got David. I mean, he's the youngest. He's just a boy. He's out watching the sheep." He said, "Well, bring him in." You know, Samuel said when he looked at David, "He's the one. He's the next king." Well, that was a problem because Israel already had a king. So now we've got David, the child king, and we got Saul, who is the real king in Israel, and that was happening all at the same time, and that created a huge mess for David. David didn't ask for that mess. David didn't do things that caused that mess. It was something that was done to him that now he found himself in a mess because word got back to Saul that there's a new king in Israel. Well, if you're king and there's somebody else that's your rival that has been appointed king, that's not okay. And Saul was very, very fearful and afraid. He was not happy at all with this decision. But God blessed David. And one day, as he grew up, he was probably a young teenager by this point. A few years went by, and David was just doing his thing at home, herding sheep. He was still appointed king, but he was just a boy, so he was doing what he was doing. One day his dad said, "Hey, I want you to go visit your brothers that are with Saul and his army and take them some care packages from home, you know, some fresh cheese and crackers and some stuff." And so David went to visit his brothers in the army, and when he got there, as you know the story, there was this giant of a man, okay, Goliath, and he was out there just kind of bad-mouthing Saul's army, and David, this precocious young teenage boy at this point, saw this giant of a man, and it incensed David. And David said, "Look, that guy's probably not any tougher than the lion and the bear that I have already killed, so what's the big deal?" And so David went to Saul and said, "Hey, I'll take care of that dude for you if you want me to." And you know the story. He took 5 smooth stones and he put him in the sling. Round and round he went, and boom, he killed Goliath and cut off his head. And all of Israel suddenly knew who David was. Up until this point, I mean, there had been talk about David, but now David was not only their appointed king, he was their liberator. He was their champion. He had defeated this giant of a man. And so fame of David went all over the nation. And it was not good because it even created more of a problem for David because Saul, everybody was talking about David now. Nobody was talking about Saul. Saul's the king. The Bible picks it up there in this story in 1 Samuel 18. It says, "In everything David did, he had great success." So God was with David. God was directing David, preparing him to take over as king. In fact, the next verse says, when Saul saw how successful David was, he was afraid of him. He was intimidated by him because all the focus and all the attention, all the loyalty seemed to be going away from Saul toward this David. But all of Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Saul had a big problem and David had a big mess. Well, the story goes that Saul figured all kind of ways as to how he could deal with this, and he came up with an idea. He said, "You know what?" He said, "Rather than trying to make David my enemy," he said, "I think I'll marry off one of my daughters to David." And so Saul went to David and said, "Hey, David, man, for all the good things you've done for us, I want to give you one of my daughters to marry. And David said to Saul, Saul, look, I'm not worthy to marry your daughter. I mean, you're the king, and I'm from a lowly family, and I'm not important. And thanks, but no thanks. I can't accept your offer. Well, now that word spread throughout the palace and went all over Israel. Here is David, who had become the champion of Israel, and now he was such a humble and meek guy that his fame just went shot through the roof again. Not only is he a great warrior, but he's a lowly and humble man. What a great guy David is. And it just got worse for David. Well, time went on, and one of Saul's daughters fell in love with David. Her name was Michal. And David apparently had a thing for her too, apparently. Because this time, Michal came to her father Saul and said, hey, I want to marry this guy. See if he'll marry me. And so Saul saw another opportunity. And he said, if I can get David married off to my daughter, then through her I can kind of control him, keep him close enough to where I can keep him where I need him to be. And so he went to David again the second time and said, David, Michal really has a thing for you, and she wants you to marry her. Would you do it? And this time David said, yeah, okay, I kind of love her too, so yeah, I'll marry her. The king thought, aha, all right, if you want to marry my daughter, here's her bride price. Here's what you got to pay me to marry my daughter. I don't want money. I don't want a herd of oxen or cattle, or I don't want land, or I don't want a lot of things. Here's what I require of you to marry my daughter. I want you to go kill 100 Philistines and bring me back the evidence. It was like this. Saul said to himself, I'm not going to raise a hand against him. I'll let the Philistines do that. Saul was very devious. And he's thinking, okay, David's going to run off and try to kill these Philistines, and they're going to kill him. End of story, done deal, fixed my problem. Well, David and his merry men went off to the Philistine camp, and not only did they kill 100, they killed 200 Philistines and brought the evidence back to Saul. Uh-oh. The plot. You guys got to read your Bible. Isn't this cool? I mean, isn't this a great story? I mean, they ought to make a movie about it if they haven't already. Well, he came back, and this is what Saul said when he saw this. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David, no man can go off and just kill 200 soldiers. And the Philistines were mighty warriors. And that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul knew, well, I'm not going to get to use her because they're in love and so forth, so I can't do that. But when all that happened, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he, David, remained his enemy for the rest of his days. Let me complete the story here a little bit before we get into the real story I wanted to focus on today. And you may say, well, what's this got to do with making messes and being messier? Just hang on. We'll get to that in a minute. One day, David was in the palace, and Saul just flipped out. I mean, he just lost it. And he took a javelin or a sword, and he flung it toward David to try to kill David, and missed. And so David escaped, and he ran out the palace, and he ran out into the desert, because now he was an outlaw, because the king had attempted to murder him in the palace and had failed. But now Saul had put a bounty on David's head. No more games, no more fun. This is over. You're dead. So David runs for his life out into the wilderness, out in the desert, and he gathers around him all of those guys who were Saul's enemies. And Saul had a lot of political enemies. But it was kind of a ragtag bunch of guys, okay? They weren't formally an army or anything, but they were out there in the desert, living in caves and living wherever they could to escape the army of Saul that was trying to hunt them down to kill them all. Okay? And that's kind of where we get into the next part of the story, and it's awesome. So one day, while David and his men were out in the desert, Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines. He and his men had been out duking it out with the Philistines. And one of his scouts said, "Hey, Saul, we have found David in the desert of En-Gedi." In other words, hey, Saul, we know where David is, and we've got him cornered, and this may be our opportunity. Okay? And so what it says that Saul took 3,000 able young men from all of Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats near En-Gedi. If you go to Israel and visit, and I have, some of you went with me, we have been to En-Gedi, and here's kind of what it looks like. It's right down by the Dead Sea. In fact, this blue up here is the Dead Sea, and it's a desert but it's like cliffs like you would see down on the Canadian River here coming up out in the canyons. It's very similar looking to that. And En-Gedi has a spring, kind of a spring in the desert. And you can see there's a little bit of foliage there and so forth. And there's caves all in the face of the canyons and so forth that are just naturally there. In fact, another look from below, looking up into doesn't that look like kind of the Canadian River? I don't know if y'all, anyway. But anyway, and so you see some waterfalls because there's natural springs down there, and this is at En-Gedi. You can visit this, and I have, and this is where David and Saul had this conflict, okay? And so it goes on to say that Saul came to the sheep pens. They were there close to the spring where the water was in the desert, and a cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now, this is the only time I think I know of where the Bible talks about going to the bathroom. But that's what happened. And I might just point this out because if you have junior high kids, and you're trying to get them involved in the Bible, and you're wondering, how can I get them involved? This might be a place you want to take them, because, anyway, okay. Junior hires seem to love, anyway, moving on. But so Saul leaves his army out here, and he walks up, kind of where we showed, into one of those caves to relieve himself, okay? He leaves all of his bodyguards behind. They're sitting out there on their mules or their donkeys or their horses, whatever they are, and they're sitting there waiting for the king to kind of go do his thing. And they're out there in the hot sun. They're tired. Oh, hurry up, king. Come on. And Saul goes up to take care of himself. Well, believe it or not, David and his men were far back in that same cave. Now, what are the odds? Come on. There's a bunch of caves at this same spot. And the very cave, now why were David up there? Well, obviously, David had scouts too. And one of their scouts had seen Saul's army headed toward them and came to David and said, "David, Saul's coming closer. We better do something." And David said, "Well, let's not try to outrun him. Let's split up. Let's hide in the caves. And when his army passes by, then we'll go the other way and we'll escape." Okay, so that's kind of what they were doing. So David and his men were hiding far back in this cave, thinking that Saul and his army would eventually, go off and then they would be able to be free. Well, as it turns out, the very cave that Saul decided to use, I'll just leave it there, was where David and his men were hiding. So David and his men, they saw this because their eyes had adjusted to the dark, and they see this guy coming in the cave. Saul can't see because it's bright outside and he's coming in this dark cave. And the men whispered to David. They said, "Look, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" In other words, his men said, "This is a God thing, David. You've been telling us you were going to be king someday. You were telling us that God was going to do this someday. And now this is the day, David. Look, you've got Saul in the most vulnerable position that you can imagine. He hasn't a clue that we're here, and he doesn't have any of his bodyguards around. It's just him in this cave. David, this is your chance." Wow. David got all caught up in that because he said, wow, this is not just coincidence. This has to be God. And David was a warrior, and he knew that he could sneak up on Saul. Saul would, because he was a warrior, he knew Saul would not know what was coming until David grabbed his hair, yanked his head back, and slit his throat, and it would be done. Because David could say this to himself, I'm just doing unto him as he intends to do unto me. Saul was out there waiting to kill David. You could say self-defense. You could say he deserved it. He could say any of these things. But David had his opportunity. He was just going to do to Saul what Saul was trying to do to him. Let me take a little side pause here in the story. We'll get back to it in a minute. Because there's something here that we need to address, okay? And it's the idea of virtue. Virtue is something that, it's described as integrity, honesty, patience, self-control. Virtue is something that is an option for all of us that God honors. And He desires us to act and decide things in virtue. And as this says, if you ignore virtue, you will eventually create a mess. Isn't it true that most messes that you created, not all of them, but most messes that you created was because you sacrificed some virtue for expediency? Some people call it taking a shortcut. I mean, it won't hurt anything. Nobody will know. I can get by with it. It'll be okay. And after all, what harm could there be? It helps me get where I want to go. And so I'll just cut a corner here. I'll just, not have to stand up and honor virtue. It's almost like an equation. It's almost like cause and effect. You ignore virtue, you will create a mess. And if you're in a mess and you ignore virtue, your mess is going to get messier. So you're caught in a mess. So what do? Well, I'm going to cover it up. I'm going to I spent too much, so I'm just going to borrow a little more. I shop myself into poverty, but boy, I don't feel good, so I'm going to go shop some more. I'm going to just tell a little lie about this, okay? I'll just fudge a little on the facts. I'll cover it up. I'll hide it. Nobody will know. I'm going to fix it. And we ignore virtue to our own peril. And David was just about to do the very same thing. Notice it says that David then crept up unnoticed. So here he comes. There's Saul doing his business. David's men are behind him. They are so anticipating this moment because they had a bounty on their head also. And could you picture this? All of Saul's army was out there on the desert waiting for Saul to come out. What if, in their minds, David would sneak up behind Saul, would grab him by the head, slash his throat, cut off his head, and instead of Saul walking out of the mouth of that cave, here comes David holding the head of Saul. Wow. Can you picture any better way to establish myself as king? And more than likely, had he done that, all of the armies of Saul would have bowed down and declared their loyalty to David. Right? And all of David's men were just so anticipated. They had sacrificed. They had lived in the dirt. They had run for their lives. They had sacrificed everything for David. And David said, just keep hanging with me, guys. It'll be a little longer, but someday I'll be king, and then I'll take care of you. It'll be all right. And David's men were just seeing this as their golden opportunity. So here's David. He's walking up behind the king. Would it have been justified for David to do this? Of course. Saul would get what he's got coming to him. Would it be expected? Oh, yeah. Even Saul's men would expect a warrior to do that. Not to mention David's men. So, yeah, it's expected. Would it be virtuous? No. Something happened to David while he was walking up to Saul. Something in his conscience stopped him cold. And he got to thinking, someday, when I'm king, and one of my grandkids comes up and asks me, David, how did you become king? And David would say, well, one day, your grandpa came into this cave, and I snuck up behind him, and he didn't know I was there, and I slit his throat and cut his head off, and I held it out like this, and I became king. David, what happened to my dad? He had married Saul's daughter. Well, Michael, we don't really know what happened exactly. I mean, we found him in a cave and his throat was slit and he died. So I guess that's what happened. And his legacy would have been, this is how I became king. And so David, after he crept up unnoticed, he decided to cut off a corner of Saul's robe that he had laid to the side. Just a little piece, chopped it off his robe, and then backed out quietly, and Saul didn't even know he was ever there. And by doing this, David's men were thinking, what are you doing? You're blowing it. And he backed out with this piece of robe, and after he was doing that, he got to looking at this piece of robe, and he was grief-stricken. His conscience. In fact, the word says it this way, afterward, after cutting off a piece of the robe, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe, because if you take anything away from the king, it's as if you are injuring the king and disrespecting him. So his men said, hey, okay, so you don't want his blood on your hands. We don't mind at all. We would love to have his blood on our hands. We'll take care of him for you. This is what happened. David said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master? My master? Saul? The Lord's anointed. David had the realization that he didn't put Saul into power, God did. And he had. And even though Saul might not have been living up to the standards that God had instilled in the office that he had given Saul, that still didn't disqualify him from being God's anointed. And David was grief-stricken because he saw himself violating the respect that was due to a God-appointed leader. And he told his men, forbid it that I should do a thing to harm my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is anointed of the Lord. And this was the king that was out to kill him, that had already tried to kill him unnecessarily without cause, other than for his own fear and his own reputation. It says next that with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. Guys, you're not going to lay a finger on him. What? He did not allow them to attack Saul, and so Saul left the cave and went on his way. And then the story gets really weird. If you think this is crazy, wait till you hear what happens next. So Saul goes out of the cave, goes walking down to where his men are, gets on his mule. Saul rode a mule in those days. It was his preferred animal. And all of his other soldiers thought, wow, finally, we've been sitting out here in the hot sun. It's about time, King. They didn't say that, but, they were ready to go. We wanted to go home. We've been fighting the Philistines. We're tired. Let's go home. So Saul gets on his mule. They start to leave. And then David comes to the mouth of the cave and says, yoo-hoo, yoo-hoo. Well, I don't know if he said that or not. But it does say that David went out of the cave and called out to Saul. Hey, Saul! King Saul. Can you imagine the intensity of that moment? Because in that moment, every one of Saul's officers, every one of his soldiers, every one of those who were attending to Saul, every one of Saul's bodyguards understood what had just not happened. Can you imagine? He was justified. He had the opportunity. Everyone expected him to do it. Everybody would have said, yeah, David, you got your shot. Take it. Everyone understood what just had not happened. And then David goes into a little speech. He's standing up there before all of Saul and his army. And here's part of what David said. This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some, my own men, urged me to kill you, but I spared you. Not only did I not kill you myself, I did what your bodyguards failed to do. I protected you, king, from others who would have done the job for me. In fact, I had to hold them back. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed. Wow. And then he goes on to say, may the Lord judge between you and me. I'm not going to be your judge. I am not worthy to be your judge, king. But he was the king who had been appointed to replace him. I'm not worthy. I'll let the Lord judge you, king. And may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. Saul, I understand you've wronged me. You've done me dirty. But I'm not going to avenge those wrongs myself. I'll leave that to God. God will take care of that. I don't have to do that, God. Some of you in here need to hear this one. I need to hear this one. Wow. Wow. Basically, David's saying, Saul, I just did for you what no man should be expected to do. He said, I'm not even going to lay my hand on you to do you any harm. He was basically saying to Saul, I'm opting for, okay, wait here. Let me try this one. Oh, there we go. Saul, I'm opting for virtue over hurt you. David had every reason to take it into his own hands. But David understood some things about being in a mess. He was in a mess. And he understood that taking the options that would have allowed him to take control of the situation and fix it would have only made his mess messier. You see, every mess comes prepackaged with some bad options. We've talked about those already, but just, okay, if I'm in a situation, I got to fix it. Last week we talked about this a little bit, that God doesn't come into our lives in our messes to fix our messes. He comes into our lives to just say, follow me out of your mess. We want it quick. We want it done now. Take it away. Deal with it. Get it out of my life. And God says, I'm not going to fix your mess. I'm just going to invite you to follow me. And if you'll follow me, I'll take you around a lot of options that are out there that really are minefields that will get you out of your mess and won't make it messier. Every mess comes with the possibility of us making it messier because we choose bad options. David dared not to take the easy road out. He would not violate the fact that Saul was anointed by God. When God puts leaders in place, Can I just share this? You dare not lay a hand on those people. It's not your business. It's God's business. And that's virtue. That will build you up. That will take you around and out of messes. That will save you unbelievable frustration and pain and difficulty unnecessarily. And usually it's because, I'm self-righteous. I deserve this. This rascal, he tried to kill me. He's been scheming against me, and now he's out here with his 3,000 men trying to hunt me down like a dog. I have every right. He deserves what he gets coming. But he was the anointed of God. And David chose virtue over hurt you. And we have this option as well. Every mess comes prepackaged with some bad options. Let me just share something. Well, first, let's look at this next slide. It says here, your response to your mess is the real story. And let me explain that. I started to, and I didn't put that up. Whatever mess you're in today will someday, eventually, be reduced to maybe 1 or 2 sentences. And if you're old enough, like me, you'll understand this. Maybe if you're younger, you're thinking, that doesn't make sense. You're going through a very difficult divorce today in your home. And all the stuff around that, a few years from now, will be reduced to, I went through a difficult divorce. You see what I'm saying? That will be your story. Right now, it's like overwhelming. There's all kinds of stuff going on, left and right. Every minute of every day, you're fighting this battle. But someday, all of this mess that you're in today, whatever it might be, I'm going through a bankruptcy. Oh my goodness. What a mess. And you're stressed, and you're trying to figure out, and you're working with this and working with that, and trying. Someday, all of that will be reduced to, a couple of years ago, I went through a real tough bankruptcy. You see how all of our life just gets shrunk down to like a sentence or two? And that sentence or two becomes the story of your life. Your response to your mess becomes your story. So the question to end this today, the question that I would ask everyone, what story do I want to tell? Not today, but 5 years, 10 years, you're looking back on your life. And everybody else, parents, listen, I'm going to get in your business. Your kids are watching what options you choose, and you're teaching them what story their life will be. What story do you want to tell? One step further. Which of my options do I want as a permanent part of my story? That I was able to manipulate my way through? Boy, I was able to sidestep that big one. Boy, I fooled everybody. You know what options you will want to, I'll tell you what options you'll want to make as part of your permanent story. The virtuous options. That's the options you will want to be a part of your permanent record someday of the mess that you find yourself in today. I've lived long enough to know I've done it both ways. And so I can tell you from experience, I have violated this principle. I've looked for the shortcut, the easy way out. Just fudge a little on the facts, hide it so nobody knows what's going to happen. And then there have been other times when I stood up and I said, yeah, I messed up. I'm sorry. I know I promised you that I'd pay so much money and I didn't. But I'm standing up here before you today saying, if you'll give me some time, I don't care how long it takes, I'm going to pay you back every penny that you are owed. Or maybe I stand up to my children when I've blown it. And I can say, well, I'm your dad. I have the right to do however I want to you because I brought you into this world. I can take you out. Okay? Not virtuous. Or I could stand before my son when I lost my head over anger. And he was about this tall. He deserved to be disciplined, but so did his dad. And before I disciplined him, I went into him and said, son, what you did is wrong, but what I did was worse. Will you forgive me? I'm here to tell you, you want to build virtuous kids? You take the virtuous option. You want to be somebody that can breathe air and have a clear conscience before God and others, where people will look up to you and say, that is a person of His Word. He's been through some tough times. He's made some bad mistakes. But I know that's a stand-up guy or that's a stand-up gal. And let me speak to the young people for just a minute. We got all of our kids in here today, and I'm so grateful. It's so good to see you here today worshiping with us. It's so cool. So glad you're here. But kids, here's something that would apply to you. It's so easy when other people are doing bad things to justify you doing bad things because, after all, they're doing bad things. So if they're doing bad things, then that gives me the right to do bad things too. Teenagers, you're hanging with people that are violating this left and right, and it seems like that's the way to get ahead. Teenagers, take the virtuous choice. Be a stand-up person. Accept responsibility. When you screw up, don't try to cover up. Man up. Stand up and acknowledge, I blew it. I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? God will take that and exalt you to the highest place. And you'll avoid so many of the pitfalls of making a mess messier. The world will look at you and say, that's crazy. The world looked at David. I mean, isn't this a crazy story? And yet God honored David because he took the virtuous option. And 7 chapters later, in this same 1 Samuel, Saul was out again fighting the Philistines. And a Philistine arrow somehow pierced through his armor, went into his chest, and he died. And David became king. And the Bible says David wasn't perfect. Oh, I can go on telling him. David was still a mess. Okay? I mean, he did some great things here, but later on, he was a mess again. But because he was a stand-up kind of guy, when he got in a mess, the Bible calls David as a man after God's own heart. Highest praise that any of us could receive. I want to be like that. Father God, I praise you today for this wonderful example of how we can not pour more water on our flood or pour gasoline on our fire or try to clean up a soap mess or a paint mess with more paint or more soap. Father, you give us a way out. And you say, if we simply confess our sins, you are faithful to forgive us of our sins and cleanse us. That means take all the messes and just kind of wash them away. So, Father, today we stand before you. I stand before these people and declare I'm a mess that's been redeemed and forgiven by the blood of Jesus. And Lord, you invite us to live that way, to live out our faith every day as someone who doesn't try to hide or deceive or skirt around the responsibilities of our messes, but stand up and own them without excuse and say, I choose with God's help to be a person of integrity, of honesty, of patience, and of trust. I'm going to ask our prayer teams to come and stand here at the front with me. We're going to enter into a time of ministry. As I was preparing this message today, this week, God just quickened me again to the challenge of being a person who dares to live with virtue. Not repaying evil with evil, not excusing my actions because they deserved it, even though they might. To assume that I am judge and jury and convictor, executioner of people who I deem to deserve my judgment. But I choose to be a man like David who said, I'm not going to lay a finger on you. I'll let God be your judge. Even in the ways you've wronged me, I will let God deal with that. I'm not going to seek revenge. It's not God's way. I will keep my heart tender and forgiving as God gives me the grace and strength to do that. I will release you from all the wrongs that you've done to me. And I will walk in life before Jesus. I'm not looking for a quick fix. Lord, I hear your voice. I am choosing to follow you, and you will lead me out of my mess. And the next time I find myself in a mess, oh God, quicken my mind and allow me to understand the truth that I've heard today and grow and mature because I've chosen to address the mess your way.